Good evening and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to welcome all of you. We have a really full house tonight, and so we will be brief. I wanted to welcome you to the college and tell you just a bit about the Quest Lecture Series. The Quest Lecture came to Elmhurst College in 1996 to bring new ideas and outstanding speakers to our campus. It contributes to the intellectual vitality of both the college and the community in Chicagoland and beyond. It honors Elmhurst alumnus, Roland Quest, class of 1936, a former McDonnell Douglas engineer who performed some of the original design work on the space shuttle. Quest is a lecture series quickly became an enormously popular event. Previous Quest lectures have been given by Robert Ballard, Paul Sereno, Sally Ride, Jean-Michel Cousteau, Brian Greene, Anna Quindlen, Gail Collins, Elizabeth Berg, Sebastian Younger, and Paula Nastis. Now to introduce our speaker, I'm pleased to bring you Dr. Patrick Eccles. Professor Eccles chairs the college's Department of Psychology. Focusing on cognitive neuroscience, his research is concerned with brain processes underlying cognition, development of the brain, cognition in infants and children, concept formation, and executive functions and mental retardation. Dr. Eccles.
Well, let me welcome you myself. It's my pleasure to introduce Joshua Foer. We spent the last couple hours together with him learning all kinds of really great stuff. He's a tremendously interesting guy. As you know, he's going to be talking about memory tonight, his own quest for memory, and the fact that he was the 2006 U.S. memory champion after just 1 year of studying and learning how to expand his memory. It's quite an accomplishment. He set at the time the United States record for memorizing the order of a randomly shuffled deck of 52 cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds. And he tells me now the record's down to, what, 29 seconds or something like that? So things are improving. Joshua, I was told I have to tell you this, Joshua went to high school in Washington, D.C., and we don't hold that against him. Then he later went on to Yale University and graduated there in 2004. Since that time, he's been working as a journalist and writer, and thank God he moved beyond journalism to write this really great book. I was really impressed when I read this book. As a scientist, we tend to worry about journalists getting hold of scientific research. The common mantra is that they distort it, that they overhype certain parts of it. And when I read this book, I realized he spent an awful lot of time paying attention to the scientific literature on memory. And I couldn't find any mistakes. There was one mistake, but it wasn't your fault. Some guy thought there were 10 cranial nerves instead of 12. No, I didn't read the footnote. Okay. So anyway, Joshua's not talking anymore now, so no, okay. He's widely published, and he has some really interesting projects coming up, but I won't spoil it by telling people about this. So without further ado, here's Joshua to tell his great story.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I apologize that I felt that I had to defend my honor there. The book makes mention of the fact that this guy in the 19th century who memorized the 9 cranial nerves, and I guess there are now 12 that we know of, but they didn't know of 12 at that point. So anyways, there are other mistakes in the book, but we won't talk about them now. So yeah, I guess I'd love to tell you a little bit about this totally strange contest that is held every spring in New York City. It's called the United States Memory Championship. And I had gone to cover it a few years back as a science journalist, thinking that it sounded kind of quirky, kind of weird, like it was going to be an interesting little story. I expected, I guess, that it was going to be like the Super Bowl of savants. This was a bunch of guys and a few girls, a few ladies, widely varying in both age and degree of hygienic upkeep, who were poring over incredibly long lists of random words. They were memorizing entire poems. They were memorizing sheets and sheets and sheets of random numbers. There was one event in this contest where they had 5 strangers get up on stage and just reel off as much biographical information as they could possibly come up with. This is my name, my phone number, the names of my pets. I like the following 3 foods. Here's what kind of car I drive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they had to remember as much of it as they could. And they were memorizing entire shuffled packs of playing cards. And I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. And I started talking to one of the competitors, a guy called Ed Cook, who had one of the best trained memories in all of England. And he had come over as a kind of spring training for the World Memory Championships, which were going to be held that summer in Oxford. And I said to him, Ed, when did you first discover that you're a savant? And he said, oh, I'm not a savant. In fact, I have just an average memory, which didn't really make sense. He said, in fact, everybody who competes in this contest has just an average memory. We've all trained ourselves to perform these utterly miraculous feats of memory using a set of ancient mnemonic techniques that were invented in ancient Greece, that were once widely known and widely practiced. That's really interesting. And we were standing outside the competition hall. He was smoking a cigarette. And he said to me, you're a journalist. Do you know Britney Spears? I was like, what? No? Why? Because I really want to teach Britney Spears how to memorize the order of a shuffled pack of playing cards on U.S. national television. It'll prove to the world that anybody can do this. Like, well, I don't, unfortunately, know Britney Spears, but maybe you could teach me. I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? And that was the beginning of a very strange journey for me. I ended up spending the better part of the next year not only trying to train my memory, but also to investigate it, to try and understand how it works, why it sometimes doesn't work, and what its potential might be. And I met a host of really interesting characters. I got to spend time with a guy called EP, who had probably the worst memory in the world. His memory was so bad that he didn't even remember that he had a memory problem, which created all sorts of really interesting situations. I spent time with a guy called Kim Peek, who was the basis for the character played by Dustin Hoffman in the movie Rain Man. We spent an afternoon together in the Salt Lake City Public Library memorizing phone books, which was scintillating. And I had my own memory prodded, probed, tested in a number of different ways. And one of the things that I did was I went back and I read a bunch of memory treatises that had been written in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. In translation, they were originally in Latin. And I learned a lot of really interesting stuff. And one of the really interesting things that I learned is that once upon a time, this idea of having a trained, disciplined, cultivated memory, of laboriously furnishing one's mind, was not nearly so alien an idea as it would seem to us to be today. People invested in their memories in a way that it is almost impossible to contemplate from our present perspective, because over the last several millennia, we've invented a series of technologies, and I use technology in the broadest possible sense to encapsulate everything from the invention of the alphabet to the scroll, the codex, the invention of the printing press, the photograph, the computer, the smartphone, that have made it easier and easier for us to externalize our memories, for us to essentially outsource this fundamental human capacity. And these technologies have made our modern world possible, but they've also changed us. They've changed us culturally. I'd argue that they've also changed us cognitively. Earlier this year, there was a paper that was published in the journal Science that got a ton of attention. And I think the title of it was something like, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" Or at least that's how it was reported in every major publication. And basically, it was a nifty little piece of research that showed that when people know that a piece of information that they are learning is simultaneously going to be available on a computer, on the internet, they invest less in remembering it themselves. And they become a little bit lazy with their memories, and they become more forgetful. And this paper was all over the place. In fact, I was invited on to CNN to pontificate about this paper. And the host said, so is it really true that Google is making us dumb? And I said, well, this is actually an old story. Because 2,500 years ago, Socrates was up in arms about a new invention called writing. And Socrates was like, writing is going to make us dumb. He said, it's true, this is in the Phaedrus, you can look it up. He said, people are going to start taking ideas out of their minds, putting them down on papyrus, and thinking that they are still intelligent, when in fact they're just empty vessels. They're going to call this intelligence, but that's not intelligence. The culture is headed down this terrible, treacherous, no-good path. People are going to become forgetful, and it's not going to be good. Fortunately, somebody had the good sense to write this down. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be talking about it now. Thank you very much, Plato. And while I think we would say, okay, Socrates was overstating the case, writing hasn't been such a disaster, I think we can also identify something in what he was concerned about that rings true today. In any case, one of the last places on Earth where you find people really excited about this idea of training their memories is at this totally strange contest that I was telling you about, the US Memory Championship. And I was just fascinated with this, and I wanted to know, how do these guys do it? What is going on here? Do they have photographic memory? Well, I did a little bit of research, and it turns out photographic memory is basically a myth. Photographic memory doesn't exist. There's exactly one paper in the scientific literature documenting a case of photographic memory. It was published in 1970 in the journal Nature, one of the most distinguished scientific journals in the world. It was about a woman named Elizabeth who could, it was incredible. You could show her a set of dots with one eye, like this, and then you could show her another set of dots with the other eye, like this, a day later, and she could make those dots overlap in her mind's eye and see an image that would pop out of them, like one of those random dot stereograms that were popular in the 90s. Anyways, after this paper was published, they ran ads in newspapers all over the world. If you've got a photographic memory like Elizabeth, come forward, we want to meet you. And they never found a single other person who could perform this nifty trick. In fact, most psychologists now doubt that particular study. Elizabeth ended up marrying the scientist who studied her. She was never studied again. It's all a little bit strange and suspicious. But if it's not photographic memory that explains these incredible individuals, what does explain their incredible feats of memory? A few years back, a group of researchers at University College London brought a handful of memory champs into the lab to try and answer that question. They wanted to know, what is different about these people? Are they smarter than the rest of us? They gave them a bunch of cognitive tests, and the answer was basically, no, they're not smarter. Okay, do they have brains that are somehow structurally, anatomically different from the rest of us? And they did brain scans, and the answer was basically no. There was one essential and telling difference between the memory champions and the control subjects that they were comparing them to. And it was this. When they put them in an fMRI machine and looked at what was going on in their brains when they were memorizing information, it might have been a long string of random numbers or people's names, or one test they gave them pictures of snowflakes and asked them to memorize them in order. They found that the memory champions were activating a different region of the brain than the control subjects. In particular, they were activating a region of the brain associated with spatial memory. They were activating the same part of their brain that they would be using if they were driving a taxi cab or navigating by foot. Really, really interesting. Why was that? We'll come back to it in just a second. First, I need to explain to you that this sport, and I use sport in air quotes, this sport of competitive memorizing is driven by a kind of arms race, where every year somebody comes up with a new way of remembering more stuff more quickly, and then the rest of the field has to play catch up. Usually it is one of the competitors who is temporarily unemployed or permanently unemployable. But all of the techniques that are used in these memory contests ultimately come down to a concept that psychologists refer to as elaborative encoding. And it's a principle that's well illustrated by a nifty little paradox known as the Baker-Baker paradox, which goes like this. If I tell two people to remember the same word, if I say to you, remember that there is a guy whose name is Baker, capital B, Baker. And I say to you, remember that there's a guy who is a baker. Like, that's his job, that's his profession. And I come back to these two people at some later date, and I say, do you remember that word that I had told you a while back? Do you remember what it was? The person who is told the guy's name is Baker is less likely to remember the very same word as the person who is told his job is that he is a baker. That is really weird. It's the same word, different amount of remembering. What is going on? Well, it's actually tells us a lot about how our memories work, because the proper noun, baker, the name baker, doesn't really mean anything to us. In the sort of network of memories in our minds, it's actually rather untethered. It has no particular significance. But the common noun baker, we know bakers. Bakers wear funny white hats. Bakers smell good when they come home from work. Bakers, we know what bakers do. Maybe we even know a baker. And when we hear that word, all of those associational hooks are sort of inserted into it and make it easier to pull that word back out when we need it at a later date. The entire essence of what is going on in these memory competitions of remembering hundreds, thousands of numbers. I think the world record is a guy who is able to memorize the precise order of 4,140 random binary digits in half an hour. Just think about that for a second. It's mind-boggling. The entire art comes down to figuring out ways to transform capital B bakers into lowercase b bakers, figuring out ways to take information that has utterly no meaning, no significance, no context, like 4,140 random binary digits, and transform it in some way so that it has relevance, color, significance, is related to all the other things that are floating around in your skull. So one of the ways that this is done in these memory contests is through an old technique that dates back to the 5th century BC that's known as the Memory Palace. And the story goes that the Memory Palace was discovered, invented, by a Greek poet named Simonides. The story is that Simonides was attending a banquet, and he was the hired entertainment, because back then if you wanted to throw a really slammin' party, you didn't invite a DJ or a band, but you had a poet show up and recite a poem. And Simonides recites the poem, from memory of course, and walks out the door. And at the moment he does, the roof of the banquet hall collapses, kills everybody inside. In fact, it doesn't just kill them, it mangles the bodies beyond all recognition. So nobody can say who was inside, who wasn't inside, where they were sitting. None of the bodies can be properly buried. It's one catastrophe compounding another. Simonides, standing outside the banquet hall, has this realization. In his mind's eye, when he closes his eyes, he can still see where each of the guests at the banquet had been sitting. And what he figured out was that as bad as we are at remembering names, at remembering phone numbers, at remembering word-for-word instructions from our professors, we have really, really good visual and spatial memories. And if you can trick your brain into using your visual and spatial memory to remember stuff that is otherwise harder to remember, that can give you a tremendous advantage. So the way the Memory Palace works is a technique, and this was the technique that Cicero used to memorize his speeches, that medieval scholars used to memorize entire books, is that you would picture yourself in a building that you know very well. In fact, I'm actually tempted to have us build a memory palace in this room. I was saying earlier we were having a meeting with some of the students that I don't usually do this, but there's a student named Adriana who said, oh, you got to do it. It's going to be really fun. So I think maybe we will try and do this. An event from the US Memory Championships to demonstrate how the Memory Palace works as a technique. We are going to transform this room into a memory palace, and we're going to use it to memorize a list of random words, which is actually one of the events in a memory contest. To do this, we're going to need a list of random words, though. Michael, I'm going to count on you to come up with a handful of random words. Can you do that? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is break this room up into a series of locations. And maybe we'll make the first spot be this lectern. We'll make the second spot be this flagpole. The third spot will be this table over here. The fourth spot will be that painting. The fifth spot will be that column. We'll go around the room. There's a clock in the back corner. That corner will be the next spot, and then we'll go to the chimney, the brass chimney back there. And what we're going to do is, in our mind's eye, each of the words that Michael is going to read out to us, that he's coming up with, we're going to try and visualize that. We're going to try and visualize that word in each of these places. And what we're going to find, I know, is that we're going to have a very easy time making those associations. And, well, let's give it a try. Michael, we need a word.
Top hat.
Top hat, okay. We're going to picture a top hat resting on top of this podium. Okay, try and visualize that in your mind's eye. Make it a really big top hat, like right off of Abe Lincoln's head. And right there, by the flag, we're going to see garlic. We're going to see a big, stinky clove of garlic, okay? Try and actually smell it. Really imagine it's awful. I mean, whoever is going to eat that garlic is going to have terrible breath, and it's right there, and we can see it in front of the flagpole. On top of the table is the third word. A pug? Okay, that's like a dog, right? Yeah, okay. All right, so there is a pug on top of that table, and he's rolling around and barking, and we can see it and we can hear it. And over by the painting, a wine bottle. We'll have a wine bottle that is actually, it's a big dancing animated wine bottle, and it's and the woman who's sitting underneath the painting is eagerly waiting to drink from it. And there's a column over here. We'll go to the next word.
Alligator.
Alligator. There's a gentleman over here who's just got his head bitten off by an alligator. We're going to see that happening right there. The more blood, guts, the better. This is actually, I swear to God, old advice that goes back 2,000 years to the earliest surviving memory treatise written in Latin. The gorier the image, the better it will be. Also, if you can make it raunchy, that's also advice that goes back to antiquity. Maybe we'll do that with the next image by the back corner, which is
Zoe Deschanel.
okay, it's Zoe Deschanel. So now try and imagine, she's, by the way, for those of you who don't know, a very attractive, young, talented singer, actor, all-around celebrity. Imagine just the raunchiest possible scene that you can conjure in your mind's eye. I don't want to hear about it, but imagine it in your mind's eye happening back in that corner with Zoe Deschanel. And then by the chimney, the last word will be card? Car. Okay, we're going to picture a car crashing into that chimney. Okay? So you've created all of these images in your mind's eye. And if this were the US Memory Championship, you would have created not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 images, but probably 150. If you were really good, maybe 200, 250. And you'd then be called upon to recall those images, to recall those words in perfect order, and you can't make any mistakes. So what you would do is you would go back in your mind's eye, and you'd picture yourself back in Elmhurst College, and you'd look up at the podium, and you would see the first word that you were asked to memorize, which was, and then you'd walk over to the flag, and you'd see, and on the table, and over there, all right, I think you guys are all ready to do this. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. So that is the basic technique that is used to memorize everything from random words to numbers to cards in these memory contests. It's also the technique that I'm using right now to memorize this speech. You thought I was here in the auditorium. I'm actually back home and was, started at the front door of my house, and there's an image of a crazy contest, and I walk in the door, there's Britney Spears to remind me to talk about that Britney Spears anecdote, and then I go into the kitchen, and there are these characters from The Wizard of Oz that they're walking down the yellow brick road, and they remind me of this strange journey that I went on that took a year, and so on and so forth. That's actually how Cicero memorized the speeches that he gave on the floor of the Roman Senate. In fact, what he would do is create an image for every topic that he wanted to talk about and place those images in a memory palace. The phrase topic, that comes from the Greek word topos, as in place, as in a place in your memory palace. The phrase in the first place, in the first place, that's in the first place of your memory palace. That's a vestige from when people used to think about rhetoric and oratory in these spatial terms. So I thought this was all fascinating, and I got kind of obsessed with it. There was actually a problem, which was that as a journalist trying to cover these memory contests, I didn't really know what to do with myself, because memory contests, despite how exciting I may have made them sound, are actually pathologically boring events. It is actually a bunch of people sitting around taking tests. And as a journalist, that's kind of a problem, because I need drama to write about. And I mean, the most exciting it gets is when somebody starts massaging their temples. And as a journalist, I need you to give me something that I can write about. And I realized if I wanted to tell this story, I needed to walk in their shoes a little bit. And so I began trying to train my own memory. Sort of every morning, before sitting down with my cup of coffee in the New York Times, I would try and memorize something. Maybe it was a poem. I had some old high school yearbooks that I bought at a flea market, and I'd try and remember people's names from the yearbooks. Piece of advice, if you ever want to try and do this yourself, don't get yearbooks from the 1950s, because everybody looks exactly the same. And I found that over time, I just started to get kind of better and better at this. And I decided, all right, I'm going to write something longer about this whole weird world of these geeks who compete in these memory contests. And I, maybe as an afterword, will go compete myself and see what happens. The problem was, as an experiment in participatory journalism, this went terribly awry because I won the contest, which really wasn't supposed to happen. And as was mentioned, not only did I win, I set this new US record by memorizing a pack of playing cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds, which may sound impressive, but is actually totally unimpressive by the standards of the international memory community. There are contests held in 12 countries around the world, and they all look down their noses at the United States of America. We are sort of like the Jamaican bobsledders of the sport of competitive memorizing. I like to think that we are the coolest people at any contest, but we perpetually get our tushes handed to us by just about everybody. So having won this contest, I found myself in the very unlikely position and unexpected position of being the official representative of the United States of America, greatest superpower on planet Earth, to the World Memory Championships they were held in London that year. And so I took this very seriously. If you take the sport of competitive memorizing very seriously, you have to have earmuffs because you can never be deaf enough in a memory contest. Any extraneous stimulus is simply bad news. It can only distract you. The people who take this most seriously will also wear blinders. Literally, there's a guy from Denmark who competes wearing horse blinders, like right off of a horse from Central Park. The Germans take this so seriously. The Germans this speaks to something in the German soul. I can't explain it. They have regional championships, state championships, national championships. The German national memory champion is like a celebrity. He's on TV all the time. Women throw their panties at him. He's truly, it's a strange country. The Germans will wear sunglasses that have been entirely masked over except for 2 small pinholes, so that they can only see what's directly in front of them, and they're not distracted by anything that's not a playing card that they have to memorize. Anyways, I went to the World Memory Championship, and I'm afraid to say, I regret to tell you, that I gave the world an entirely unimpressive impression of American collective memory. I got absolutely destroyed by the Brits, the Germans, the Malaysians, but I'm pleased to say that I whooped the crap out of the French guy. Excuse my language. Anyways, thank you very much. I'd love to open this up to questions. I think there's like a microphone going around. Okay.
Hey, questions. If you would come up to the mic. Is this working now? It'll work fine.
Welcome to my world. Okay, I wanted to know, or having the ability to memorize.
What does sleep have to do with the ability to memorize? Funny you should mention it, because the night before the US Memory Championship, I couldn't go to sleep. I was so anxious. And I showed up the next morning, and the other competitors were basically like taunting me, because it is the single worst thing for your memory is not getting enough sleep. So sleep has a lot to do with memory. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that when we are sleeping, perhaps even when we are dreaming, that is either a byproduct or part and parcel of the encoding of our long-term memories. So sleep and possibly even dreaming are essential to remembering.
I'm sure there's always one in every audience. I need to ask you about the chicken sexers.
Oh, somebody who read the book. All right.
If they're the experts and they were paid for correct and penalized for incorrect, who checks them?
Oh, well, okay. Boy, oh boy. you're sending me down the rabbit hole here. The question is about chicken sexing, which is an obscure science that is practiced in the poultry industry, where it is imperative that you know very early on whether a chicken is a male or a female, because if you're in the business of collecting eggs, male chickens are essentially useless. And so you don't want to waste any money feeding them. You basically want to send them to their deaths as soon as possible and focus your energies on the female. So there, in the 1930s, some Japanese scientists, poultry scientists, figured out that there is a technique that is very difficult to learn, takes thousands of hours of practice, that you can use to identify the sex of a chicken when it is just a few days old by looking at its rear end with just the right kind of eyes. And I write about this in the book in the context of talking about expertise and how expertise and memory are related, because this is a very, very fascinating form of expertise. And the question was, I mentioned in the book that in that chicken sexers would be penalized when they would get the sex wrong, and he wanted to know how they would know if they got the sex wrong. The answer is the chicken would grow up and not lay eggs. And when that was the case, they would have to pay a fine.
But wouldn't it be their best interest to err on the side of hypothesis, and even the ones that are possibly male, as even if they were female, but would you want to err on the side of, hey,
You're right.
this one's a male, I just, so
So you'd throw away extra female. I have to think about that, but I think you're right.
false positives would be somewhat beneficial to yourself.
This is why I like talking at colleges. Yeah, I have to think about that. I think you're right, though. Yes. Oh, actually, you know what? I see. There's a line. I apologize. Sorry.
Whoa, sorry. I was just wondering, how do they make sure that, or I don't know if do they have to have normal memory, that they just use the techniques, or do they actually, is it just, they just assume that everyone that comes in has like a normal, it's like there's certain people who have like perfect graphical memory, autobiographical memory and stuff like that.
So I think the best evidence that I've found for the non-existence of extraordinary innate memory is that nobody has ever shown up at one of these contests with such a skill. And here are people who have a lot invested in remembering a lot. There are, however, as you mentioned, these people with extraordinary autobiographical memories. And they got a lot. There was a big story on 60 Minutes about them roughly a year ago. It's a condition that's known as hyperthymistic syndrome. It was discovered in the last 10 years. There are about a half dozen people who have been found with it. And I interviewed the first woman who was ever found with this condition. Her name in the medical literature was AJ. And she could remember something that happened on every day of her life. She couldn't remember everything, but she could remember something from every day since about age 8 or 9. And I went and I quizzed her. I mean, I came prepared, August 18th, 1988. Do you remember what was on Murphy Brown? And by God, she did. It was incredible. And since she was discovered, a few other people have been found with this condition. There is one thing that tends to unite these people. They all have some degree of obsessive compulsive disorder. And I found, as I was interviewing AJ, that there were some strange things that started to come out. For example, that she keeps binders with printouts of the weather from every day of her life. She keeps obsessive diaries in really, really small print that she showed me. She collects everything. And every morning when she wakes up, when she's blow drying her hair, she thinks back on what she did that day a year ago, on that day the year before that, the year before that. She scrolls through her life like a Rolodex. And so she's constantly rehearsing her life. And so for me, this raises a really interesting question. Is what's incredible about these people with hyperthymistic syndrome Is it that they have some sort of incredible innate memory ability? Or is it the case that if any of us were so motivated and invested in remembering our own lives, if every morning when we woke up, when we were well, whatever, taking a shower, if we thought back on what we did that day, the year before, and we kept doing what she does, would any of us be able to remember our entire lives? I don't know, but I find that fascinating, and I suspect it'll be much more interesting research in the years ahead about this supposed condition, hyperthymastic syndrome. Yes.
Josh, thank you so much for coming tonight and for writing that book. Just started reading it. It's amazing.
Thank you.
The way you weave your own journey with the history of memory, and it's a great book. I wanted to ask if you could just talk a little bit about the difference between memorizing things and how, for short term, and how you, like if you walk into a party and you're able to remember 10 people's names and faces and what they do, like how do you take that and remember it that a year from now? Is it possible to do that?
Well, look, anything that's going to stick for the long term. So I would say this, the kinds of techniques that I was learning and using were like really efficient, great ways to get the memory in there, But anything that's going to be made memorable for the long term really does have to be repeated. If you could, I would argue that you're probably making more memorable memories using these kinds of memory techniques. But if you really want to, for example, remember a poem, like really, really permanently remember a poem, it's not just enough to look at it once and use a memory devices to commit it to memory once. If you really want to remember it for the long term, you got to go back and revisit it. Maybe the next day you revisit it, and then maybe 2 weeks after that, and then maybe 6 months after that, and then maybe 2 years after that. That principle of spaced learning is something that psychology has known about, cognitive science has known about for over 100 years. And it's one of the best demonstrated principles of cognitive science, that this is the best way to learn material for the long term. It's really interesting. I would argue that our entire education system is set up in a manner contrary to this principle. If you think, if you think about it for a sec, everybody here who's in college, how do you learn material? You take a course in 19th century French history, and you are bombarded with a ton of information, kings and wars and all this stuff, facts, ideas. Then you have this big test at the end of the semester that you probably stay up late the night before cramming for. And you take the test, and we consider this a measure of how well you have learned the information. And then the next day, from that day for the rest of your life, nobody will ever care whether you learned that information. If you think about it, it's kind of crazy, right? How much do you actually remember from the courses that you took in college? People who have graduated from college a long time ago who are here in the audience. I would wager not much. And I think given that we know how effective spaced learning is, maybe our curricula should be set up in such a way that you learn something about French history one year, and actually the next year, whatever you're learning has to relate to that. And 2 years later, it has to relate to it again. And we should be learning in a more cumulative fashion, given that we know that that kind of cumulative learning is what makes memories really stick. But it's another story. Yeah.
All right, I just wanted to know, everything that you've talked about has been pretty good, has been actually really good with helping you out with winning a championship, but has it helped you out in your everyday life at all?
Well, yes and no. Being able to memorize the order of a shuffled pack of playing cards, not exceptionally useful skill, except maybe in Las Vegas, where it's an exceptionally useful skill. I actually don't know that that's true. Although I do know that several of the memory competitors are persona non grata in Las Vegas. Remembering people's names, that's handy. You have to remember to use a memory technique, right? You have to remember to turn that capital D Baker into lowercase d Baker. You have to remember that when you meet Joshua Foer, you create some sort of an image in your mind's eye at that moment. Say, oh, 4, 4. Oh, like the number 4. Oh, okay. Why don't I imagine somebody graffitiing the number 4 on this guy's face? And he's really upset about it. And okay, next time I see him, that image is going to pop back into my mind. You have to remember to do that. You have to remember to remember. It's handy in that sort of a situation. It's handy for remembering speeches. It's handy for remembering shopping lists. It's handy for remembering stuff. The problem is, we live in a world where we really don't have to remember stuff anymore. Because, frankly, if somebody tells me something interesting, if somebody tells me something I need to know, I take out my smartphone and I send myself an email, or I put it in my to-do list. Our culture is radically changing its relationship to memory right now. I mean, we're in the midst of a shift as profound as the one that Socrates was concerned about, that shift from morality to literacy. We're shifting from being a culture that actually has to use our memories for stuff to being one that has technology that does all of our remembering for us. And I think it remains to be seen what the costs of that are going to be. Yes?
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening. Valuable information that we're gaining. What I'd like to ask you is there's a group of us that just started med school first year, and the days of cramming, like you indicated, are no longer working for us. We are totally bombarded with new material in which, as you gave us some of the techniques here, you can visualize it because you know what a pug looks like or a wine bottle looks like. But when you're giving text that you really have no idea, because it's, and it's advanced text and it's a lot of text at the same time, what would you suggest we utilize when we're getting like 8 pages in one class of things like this, that we have to memorize every little detail in a week, 2 weeks' time?
Right. So my wife, oh my God. So my wife is a third-year medical student. So she already took the boards last year, which is the big test that you have to take, one of the big tests you have to take to qualify to be a doctor. And so this was like a chance to put the rubber to the road, see, because all of a sudden she actually was like, Josh, I need to learn these biochemical pathways. Like, can we come up with some tricks to help me do that? And so we did. We actually, there are, for structured information, stuff like chemical pathways or some of the pharmacological tables and that. I don't know about muscle charts. I actually don't even know what that is. But for like pharmacological stuff where you have like all the side effects, what we would do is we'd come up with like little images or little stories about each of these things, mnemonics, right? There are, for medicine is one field that completely embraced, where like the art of memory has not disappeared, because you can go buy all of these books that are just filled with little tricks for remembering all this complicated stuff. I mean, you've probably encountered them already, these, handbooks of mnemonics for doctors, so that when you encounter somebody and you see, well, whatever, yeah. So, I don't know. The answer to the question is yes, there are places in studying medicine where you can use these sorts of memory devices, but there are other things where they're not that useful. Like, yeah. At least that's what we found.
Kind of a sort of a follow-up to that question is, I understand how you use the memory palace for familiar items, long lists. How would you use it, no pun intended, on a foreign language if you're trying to learn it, because the words are, you have no context of the meaning of a foreign language?
Yeah, you wouldn't use a memory palace to learn a foreign language. You wouldn't. I don't think there are memory tricks for learning a language per se, but Ed Cook, who's the guy who was smoking the cigarette, Britney Spears, my memory coach, he has a company that he started. It's a web app. It's called Memrise, MEMRISE. I just read in the newspaper today that they got $1 million in funding from venture capitalists. And you can go visit their website. And what he's doing is using these memory techniques to not teach foreign languages, but teach foreign language vocabulary. So he can't teach you Chinese, but he figures if he can come up with mnemonics to help you remember the 2,000 most common Chinese characters, that you at least will be able to find your way around the streets of Shanghai. And so that's what his website does, and it takes advantage of that principle, not only of creating images and little stories for each of the words that you have to remember, the pieces of vocabulary, but also takes advantage of the spaced learning principle. And so it knows when the optimal moment is to refresh your memory about a given piece of vocabulary that you've learned. And so it has a sense of sort of when you're starting to forget a given Chinese character, for example. And so I'd urge you all to check it out. I think it's pretty neat. It's still obviously in development, but MEMRISE.com.
To that, what is your opinion of programs like SuperMemo and other computer-based programs? Do you have one that's favorite?
I think isn't SuperMemo, I'm not sure, but isn't that also basically based around the principle of spaced repetition?
Right.
So yeah, anything like spaced repetition, the effects are dramatic. I mean, I think I remember seeing a study that showed something like you can, in the same number, you can in half as many learning sessions spaced every 2 months, learn the same amount of material with the same memory as twice as many learning sessions spaced every week, or something like this. The effects of learning something, going away from it for a while, coming back to it, are really dramatic. So anything that takes advantage of that is. Oh, good. All right, thanks.
One more question. My question actually goes along with the med student's question. If you're trying to learn complex material like a process, would you recommend trying to, like, in your storehouse also going with a process like a laundry machine, and how, like, the process of doing laundry and memorizing that and associating that with the process involved in the medical fields? Like, I don't know.
Not sure I understand the question exactly.
I just don't know if, like, you did that with your wife, you know, like neurotransmission, how to memorize something like that. That's a process.
Well, look,
it's
I mean,
like a simple concept.
So what these sorts of memory devices are doing are taking information that really, you're creating a kind of artificial context for information. The best context for information is real context, right? So really understanding how a neural pathway works. It's one thing when you have to memorize a list of drugs, right? Which you may never be in a position of, you know, you might be a psychiatrist and you don't really need to know all of the drugs that are used by gynecologists, but they make you know that to pass the med school boards. Okay, so in those sorts of situations, memory techniques make sense. If you've got to learn this stuff, you might as well come up with an efficient way to do it. But if you're talking about a process, you want to really understand how it works. No, you might, well, so the principles behind why this stuff works, right? Like using visual imagery is a good idea. Using narrative to help you remember stuff is a good idea. If you have to remember something that's sort of an ordered list of information, taking advantage of your spatial memory in some way or another is probably a good idea. Might mean drawing whatever it is that you're trying to learn. But the memory palace itself is kind of is a highly artificial strategy that's very useful for certain kinds of information, but not for everything. One last question, yeah.
Nobody's asked about, is there a different technique for remembering numbers?
There is, yes. But maybe this is my chance to say, it's in the book. Which will be available for sale. There is, but it actually will take a little bit of time for me to get into, so I shouldn't. But there's a really simple trick for remembering numbers that I use. It's how I know what room number I'm staying in the hotel. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Foer, for taking the time to come out to Elmhurst College and give such an insightful presentation. If you haven't read the book already, it's great. There's that great punctuated humor in the lecture. It's also in the book. It's a very good introduction to memory generally and this little quirky world of memory championships. So if you haven't read it, get a hold of it. All right. And now I'd like to present Mr. Foer with a gift on behalf of Elmhurst College.
Thank you very much. All right. Cool.
Yeah. All right. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and I encourage you to attend upcoming events on campus. This next month's coming events are the Quest Lecturers, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee. He's a cancer researcher and author of The Emperor of All Maladies. Heidi Cullen, researcher for Climate Central and author of Weather of the Future. And on Tuesday, March 6th, we have the Shade Lecture featuring Marty Martin. He's going to be giving a presentation on H. Richard Niebuhr, A Centennial Appreciation. For additional information on these and other campus-related events, please visit our website at www.elmhurst.edu. Again, thank you for joining us. Our lectures are free, but that does not mean they're without cost. So if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, as I have, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Friends of the Arts at Elmhurst College. You can do so by using the envelope that came with your program, one of these, or you can simply give the contribution to one of the students in the lobby with the buckets. We'd greatly appreciate your support. Again, thank you everybody for coming, and have a safe trip home.